So one of the things we've been doing, if you haven't been here, hello, we're going through an overview kind of the Bible, but we're looking at the way the Jews, the Hebrew Bible, kind of established their structure, because that literary style, they build up upon one another, and there's a narrative being flown even in the, not just the story, but in the way it's being delivered and developed, and the way it was first put together. We've come along and changed it, not drastically. Actually, the way we have it run actually can work as well. There are some things that work nicely together with the way your English Bible will have it structured. But this is much more of a Eastern mindset. The way they have it structured is much more geared towards their thematic approach rather than needing a pure chronology. They stick with chronology as much as chronologies go, but thematically things happen in order on purpose. And so I want to first throw out, is there any questions, as we've been going through these studies? Are you guys, any questions coming up as you're reading, things you guys would like to know, more about? I know I'm kind of going a little quickly. This was supposed to be a one class, and we're now on like week 6, so any questions before we jump in? Okay, so last time, a couple weeks ago, if you weren't here, we went through the former prophets, and the former prophets just start with Joshua. We think of prophets, we start thinking Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, but actually Joshua is the first in the Hebrew Bible former prophet, and the former prophets ends in 2 Kings. Hello, here, let's get you some notes here. Yep. Okay, let's get you 2 sets. Joshua, Isaiah. Here we are. All right, there's 2 sets of each of them here. We did get to see each other. It's probably colder here than in Florida, right?
Yeah. This might be the coldest week. Beginning of the week might be the coldest week we'll get this year. So.
Okay, so we finished up kind of 2 Kings. I'll just kind of do a quick, we're going through the overview of the Bible. We're kind of going it through the Hebrew version of it, how they structured it. And so we started with the former prophets, started in Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. And remember, Kings and Samuel, they were one book, right? One scroll. We divided them into 2. They have one kind of thought going through all of them. And 2 Kings ended with just kind of this, they go into exile, right? They go into captivity. And the king is being, Nebuchadnezzar. He's not a very good king, at least at first. His grandson's not a very good king, evil Merodach. But what does he do with the last king that we have read about, Jeconiah, at the end of 2 Kings? What does he do to him? It's the very end of 2 Kings. He, out of nowhere, the story ends. They're in captivity. They're in exile. They've been destroyed. And the king, we don't give rhyme or reason. It doesn't tell us anything besides he set him free from prison. He let him sit at the king's table for the rest of his life. He dined on the king's dime. Okay? And that's how 2 Kings ends. So there's this glimmer of hope that God's not done with Israel just because they're going to exile. Now remember, this is an established principle all the way back in the Torah, in Deuteronomy, this idea of cursing and blessing. Just because, and I do this all the time, but I want to always, you guys remember this idea that there's this is the covenant, okay? And Israel can kind of choose what side of the coin they want to live on. They can live in the blessing side, where you can go read Deuteronomy 28 all the way through 31, and you'll get, if you live a certain way, follow the God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, here's the life you can live, here's the nation you can be, here's the kind of people you can be. Or if you want to follow after the other gods, and you want to, go after idols, and you want to, not do justice and mercy and treat your neighbor poorly, here's the curse. Okay, here's all the curses that will happen. And we kind of looked at that last week. Remember, Samuel started off with this idea that Hannah, she can't give birth. And that's a sign that they are living under a time of cursing, because blessing would be that wombs were opened and that, that their seed would be plentiful. We saw that in Exodus. Hello. And so we're living under a curse, but here's the cool thing. Just because they're living under a curse, exile, their wombs not being fruitful, does that bring them outside of God's covenant? Israel is still, at this time in Kings, still God's covenant people. So there are overarching blessings. There are overarching blessings and promises that will always be true no matter what Israel does. At least until the time of the Messiah. Okay? Because there was the seed that was going to come through Abraham. And remember, we talked about this idea that when God made the covenant with Abraham, He put Abraham to sleep, and God walked through the covenant by Himself. So He basically told them that I am going to bless your people. I'm going to bless you as a nation. I will not leave you nor forsake you. I will be your God. And it doesn't matter if you're living under a time of curse, and that's what you're seeing at the end of 2 Kings, that God is still with them. When they go into exile, right? The whole book of Ezekiel is about them being in exile. And what is Ezekiel chapter 1? What does Ezekiel see in a vision? He sees the Spirit of God move from Jerusalem, and it's floating, and it's coming and resting in Babylon. That would have been mind-blowing to Israel, that God's Spirit, especially sitting on His throne, it's as if He just picked up His throne, right? And the cherubim and the seraphim were there, and they were carrying Him, and there were the flaming wheels and all this stuff, right? And they're sitting, and they're coming and dwelling with the people in Babylon. And so there is a promise that God made to Abraham, right? Through your seed, right? And there's also this land promise, and we'll talk about a little bit about that. That gets expanded and developed in the latter prophets, which is what we're getting into. And Isaiah starts the latter prophets. So the latter prophets is the three major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. And then there are the 12, they call them. That's what they call them. Hebrews call them the 12. We call them the minor prophets. Now, why would you think they're called the minor prophets? It's just because the books are small. It doesn't mean their significance is minor, major. Okay? One just takes up this much word space, and one takes up this much word space. And the minor prophets literally just recycle the same themes. And what you want to see, what you see in the minor prophets, day of the Lord, day of the Lord, day of the Lord, day of the Lord, everything is about this day of the Lord. And as you're studying, the day of the Lord is an actual event that is probably going on during that time, right? Captivity, coming back from captivity, some kind of judgment. But at the end of almost every minor prophet, it gets expanded to be a messianic day of the Lord, when the Messiah would come, and it would be the day of the Lord. That's what we always got to keep in mind when we talk about fulfillment. Fulfillment, once again, prophecy is not, hey, in the future, this one event's going to happen. Fulfillment is a layered, it will have multiple fulfillments, but in Jesus, it is the fullest it will ever be. It's the most filled. The day of the Lord, there will be no greater day of the Lord than what Jesus can bring, okay, and what Jesus did bring. There will be no greater kingdom that is coming than the one that Jesus brought. Now, there are times where you can see, well, this is very specific about a very specific, individual, and nobody really fits that bill until the time of Jesus, okay? So there are some of those, but I would suggest there's a lot less of those than the dual fulfillment. Even the servant, the suffering servant, at first, a lot of the suffering servant, you know who the servant of the Lord was during the time of Isaiah? Who was the one who was going to suffer on behalf of Israel and was going to be persecuted on behalf of preaching the word of God and trying to rescue Israel? It was Isaiah. Like, you go back to Isaiah, the first, chapter 6, God tells him, you will be my servant, you will suffer, you will preach, they will not listen to you, but your suffering will come from your own people. Well, Jesus, when He comes, he fulfills that in a way that Isaiah never could. Okay, so there are these layered prophecies. So there's these blessings and promises. So when you're reading, I made a list, okay? These are themes you want to constantly be looking for. One of the things that I promote very heavily is the Bible is not just an arbitrary history, okay? It's a specific history about specific people, and God, or the writers, the authors inspired by God, is hand-picking stories. Because like in between some of these books, there's 400 years. Do you think God was not working in between Genesis and Exodus? No, he definitely was, right? But God is revealing to us a specific set of stories. And even in the book of Kings, there's some kings we don't even get. There's gaps in between. There's gaps in between the prophets. There are things you hear, but wait a minute, I never read about that guy. Yeah, he just mentioned, but we skipped him. And God is pulling out specific stories. It's not all of Israel's history. So you always have to ask the question, if God is choosing to tell you this story, why is he telling you this story versus maybe another? And why does he phrase things this way? Robert Alter, we preface this with, he's not a Christian, okay? Robert Alter. But he is probably the number one Hebrew scholar in all of the world, meaning he studies the language and the culture and the people in ancient Near Eastern Hebrew because he just finds it fascinating. He thinks the Bible is one of the most miraculous, it's funny, he uses that word literally, miraculous book in the world, because nowhere else do we have a history that has been so well preserved, and a language, right? A lot of times when you're studying language, you're finding fragments here and fragments there, and you're finding, and you're just, you're getting a snippet. You're finding whole scrolls. That's gold to a person who's studying a language. And one of the things that he says is the Hebrews, and especially during that time, and Canaanites and all those people who lived around them, they were myth tellers. Now, when you think of the word myth, you think of what? Fable. No, myth is just the way you tell a story, the retelling of a story with an emphasis. So we as Westerners, when we retell a story, a lot of times we want to make sure we're just getting every detail, right? And we're really concerned about, wait, what was it, day one or day? They are retelling a story in a way with many times a specific point coming out of that story. So sometimes, now don't throw stones at me, he says there are some, when he calls them exaggerations, he's not saying as if they're lying, but like when they're numbering the people. There are some times where you go and you number the people and you read one numbering and they're like 100,000 people. Then all of a sudden, like 5 years later, they're numbering the people and they're 100 million. You're going, 5 years? The point is he's showing how this nation is growing and growing, and a lot of times they use multipliers. They will multiply things by 10 because that is a human perfect number, right? And so they'll multiply numbers, but they're trying to tell you a story. Like we talk about this number all the time. Everything just happens to be in these perfect 40-year increments. Moses' life, 40 years, 40 years, 40 years. Wilderness, a perfect 40 years. Elijah in the wilderness for 40 days, right? When you're doing certain feasts, for everything, Jesus in the wilderness for 40. Is it really 40? That's the question we got to ask. Or does 40 come to represent something? Because a lot of times when you're adding the math and when you get like an actual chronology, they may have been in there for 37 years and 8 months. But guess what they're going to do? They will round it to 40 if there is some kind of testing going on. 7 becomes a perfect or a complete number. Okay? And one of the best, I don't know if you can read that, but one of the best illustrations of that is Nebuchadnezzar. Remember, how many years did it say Nebuchadnezzar would be in the wilderness eating grass and down? It says 7 years. Well, historically, we actually have a tablet that says Nebuchadnezzar left his duty for 4 years, around that same exact time of when Daniel was. Is it 4 or 7? The point is 7 to the Jews is a complete number in the sense of as long as it took for Nebuchadnezzar to recognize something and to realize something. Okay, so 7 becomes this ideal number because, and it all goes all the way back to Genesis. When God created the heavens and the earth, he did it in 7 days, and it was what? It was complete. And so these numbers take on significance. Okay, so you want to find these themes and these numbers, and you want to see why are we using 40 here? Well, you're going to see a testing. You're going to see them going through a trial and coming out of that.
So Jesse, can I ask you?
Yeah.
Help me reconcile. So if we think of those as complete,
Yeah.
how do we reconcile that with folks who will question the Genesis account and say, oh, well, if we are just saying these are complete numbers and may not be, because we always think of Scripture as accurate, inspired, and
Yeah.
it's true.
Yeah.
It just,
Well,
I think
the calendar
it's
was
gonna-
different than too.
Yeah, so even the reckoning of days, is different, right? But here's one of the cool things, and Genesis has a lot more going for it of the 7 days than just the number itself. Because even in Exodus, when they actually establish their work week, Moses will point back, we are going to have 7 days, 7 literal days because of, right? But this, I believe, the Genesis account is your first, it's the principal establisher. That's why I believe 7 days is probably literal. And then a lot of times this gets used, like your first one is always more of the literal usage of it, where it has established the precedent, and then the number takes on significance later. Okay? You understand that? Like the 40 years, in the wilderness is probably, 40 years. Elijah was, when you start adding up time and when he says how long he was ago, it probably wasn't a full 40, even days where he was in the wilderness. But the Bible will then use that, especially when you get to the prophets. The prophets, especially in prophecy, will start using these numbers. Go to Revelation, and they take those numbers and fly with them, right? And everything becomes a multiplier of 7 or 10 or 3, or they'll cut 7 in half, and they'll put 3.5 and 3.5 together, right, to make a 7 incomplete when you bring it. So there's a lot of times they manipulate those numbers, but there's a lot more going, in my opinion, for a 7-day literal creation account than just the numbering itself. Jesus referencing it back. There's a lot of, other references to this literal idea. But once again, we also have to remember, when it was written, Moses, when he's writing this, didn't have in mind later people who are going to question. His point is to show one thing, and a lot of times we want to use the Bible as a scientific book, and it has science in it, and every time science is mentioned, it's accurate. But especially when it comes to dating and numbers, you got to be careful because Jews thought differently. That's why when you're reading Kings and Chronicles, or Samuel and Kings when they overlap, or Chronicles and Samuel when they overlap, they will have differing accounts of the days, but one is a kingly order, right? The king's account, which is much more accurate, and Chronicles will come in, and it's a priestly account. And the priests, once again, they will play with numbers. Chronicles will play with numbers all day long, and to make them match Torah numbers and how long feasts were supposed to last. It's interesting. But that's the idea of myth. Myth to them is the retelling of a story for a specific purpose. That's why we have 4 gospel accounts. They are 4 very much different accounts of the life of Jesus. And even when they retell the same event, what do you find? You find differences that are almost, if you're coming at it from just a purely word for word, if you think when I say word for word inspiration, meaning word for word, everything is accurate 100% every time it mentions anything, well then you're going to have some issues when, there's two retellings of account and they're completely different from two inspired people? Who are they writing to? What grouping are they putting in? A lot of times Matthew is retelling it with the emphasis of the teaching on Jesus being the king. When Mark will retell it just to, hey, this is what he did, right? Jesus did. This is what Jesus did. This is what Jesus did. And Matthew will group things together. John has the temple, the cleansing of the temple at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. Well, the Gospels, all the two other Gospels that account it, have it at the end of his ministry. Which one is it? Did he have two? Most people, that's probably unlikely that he had two of them. But John, and if you were in my John class, we watched how John reordered things, and he actually followed the feast cycle. He followed the cycle of the Jewish year rather than when Jesus did it. So he's going this feast to this feast to this feast to this feast. But this one was in his first year ministry. This one is his second year ministry. And he actually did the one first. But John's trying to tell a thematic retelling because most people already have Matthew, Mark, and Luke by the time John writes it. Matthew, Mark, and Luke have already been told, written down. He's retelling it for a different purpose. Okay? So we got to be less concerned, and the more it's really cool when you read a lot of like Canaanite stories and Hebrew stories outside of the Bible, and you'll have like 5 different accounts of the same thing, people who were there, and it's all different retellings. Well, who are they retelling it to? What purpose are they retelling it for? Okay? But I don't want to spend too much time on that idea, but we just got to remember that especially the Jews, here's where I was going with that. The Jews, when the Bible was actually written down, okay, is probably not until after captivity. Once again, we went through a couple weeks ago where we see notes in like Deuteronomy and Joshua and Judges that, hey, there was no king at this time. Well, what does that mean? That means this was probably written during a time when the kings were going on, but he's telling it to people who are used to kings and saying, hey, this is before Israel had a king. Well, how would an author know that unless he's on this side of the story? Or you can just say everything's God and God just gave them insight, right? Which he also does. But there's little notes that'll say, hey, this city used to be called, it's modern day, right? Questions or comments there? Someone had their hand up. Ben?
I think that when reading the scriptures, especially, and you have all of these where it's like inspired, written, somebody writes it, that's the human element to it. So there's so many different nuances. And like especially the Gospels, it's 4 different people.
Yeah.
I think that speaks to the actual validity of the Bible and as a whole. Because it's like you said, if you have you have 2 people watch the same football game, they watch it completely different.
Especially if they're different fans.
Yes, right?
One's going to see, hey, the refs, they were horrible. The other one's going to go, the refs were great. What are you talking about?
And so, like that,
we love the refs.
You have inspired humans writing out tellings that are written to a specific person or a specific group of people to kind of plant home a theme or idea, but also to kind of carry in a previous. I think that's, for me, sometimes the hardest thing when actually reading through the Bible to like, you kind of have to like pause first before you read. Okay, who wrote this, and kind of when, why, and who was it written to, and who was it written about?
Yeah.
And when you have that thought process when reading, it makes the scripture takes on a total different process or total different interpretation just from you from that.
Yeah, and what I'm not saying is that there are made-up events and made-up things that are going on, and people, they're just like, well, we need a 40 in there, so someone went out to a wilderness sometime, and just, that's not what I'm talking about. It's a retelling that is accurate in its entirety, but they will play with maybe even the way in which it played out in a different order just to have a different emphasis, is all I'm saying. And that's okay. We do it all the time, right? We do it, and we're okay with that. Because they weren't concerned with history the way we are concerned with history, needing an index. And so these are themes that you want to constantly be looking for, right? And so let's get to our chart. The latter prophets, Isaiah. So remember, we ended in Kings. So if you're reading the Hebrew Bible, after you read 2 Kings, the next book you're going to come into is not Chronicles in the Jewish Bible. You're going to come into Isaiah, Okay, Chronicles is actually the last book in the Hebrew Bible before Matthew, which, if you remember, I said Chronicles genealogy starts off with a genealogy in First Chronicles. Literally, Matthew and Chronicles genealogy are the same. One's leading up to the modern day, one's leading up to Jesus. Okay? So Isaiah, what's his major emphasis? We're looking at Israel's Messiah. If we are going to have the people of Israel in exile, then somebody needs to save them. Somebody needs to save them. Now, interestingly enough, does Isaiah preach after the time of 2 Kings ends? No. So 2 Kings ends with them already in captivity. How long did Isaiah preach before they ever went into captivity? About 125 to 150 years before they ever go into captivity. Isaiah's warning them. So when you're reading this, you're reading the captivity, you're not reading the warnings yet. All of a sudden you get smacked, you're like, we're in captivity. And then the Jewish Bible transitions to go, why are we here? How did we get here? If you ever want to read a really good commentary on the book of Kings, it's by Michael Whitworth. And he wrote one, How to Lose a Kingdom in 400 Years. And it's a retelling. Michael Whitworth is a genius at retelling the Bible story while infiltrating it with Isaiah and Ezekiel, showing how did we lose this kingdom in 400 years from when David got it and it was established in Jerusalem till 2 Kings, it's 400 years. How did we lose it? That's essentially what Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel are telling us. How did we lose this? Okay? But there is this element of hope in Isaiah. Right? When you start off, let's go open your Bibles to Isaiah. Look at Isaiah chapter 1. Somebody read Isaiah 1. Read the first 9 verses. Isaiah 1, 1 through 9. Don't all jump.
The vision of Isaiah the son of Amos, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. Hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth, for the Lord hath spoken. I have nourished and brought up children, and they have rebelled against me. The ox knoweth his owner, and the ass his master's crib. But Israel doth not know, my people doth not consider. All sinful nation, people laden with iniquity, a seed of evildoers, children that are corrupters. They have forsaken the Lord, they have provoked the Holy One of Israel unto anger.
All right, we'll stop right there. So you're seeing this idea. Why are we in captivity? How did we get here? Isaiah, the very next book, starts off with, you're rebellious people, you're rebellious children, you did not listen to the word of the Lord, you're a sinful nation, you have forsaken the Lord. Of course they'd get there. Right? Of course they would get there. This is how they get there. Now jump over and read chapter 2 in verse 1 and 2. Well, read the first 5 verses.
The word that Isaiah the son of Amos saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. And it shall come to pass in the last days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established in the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow into it. And many people shall go and say, Come ye, and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. And he will teach us his ways, and we will walk in his paths, for out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And he shall judge among the nations, and shall rebuke many people, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. O house of Jacob, come ye, and let us walk in the light of the Lord.
All right. So you have faithless city, right? And you read chapter 1, he calls them all sorts of names, right? Ones we wouldn't want to repeat sometimes, okay? The prophets use some colorful language, okay? And You know, you got to get your big boy pants on and big girl pants on when you read these books, because they're not pretty, because that's the consequence of sin. And God is willing to really shock and awe you. He's not wanting you to think, you know, a lot of times we replace the word sin with mistake. And some things are mistakes, right? Unintentional sin is what we call them. Sometimes sins are just what? They're sin, right? And God has some pretty names for people who continuously rebel against Him. But there is this hope that in the latter days, right? Last days, sometimes it's called. It'll be used as day of the Lord as well. God will come and teach His people. But what has God been doing? God has been teaching, but through prophets, through Moses. Connect Hebrews 1, verses 1 through 3. In the latter days, in former times, God what? Spoke through prophets, various means and various ways. But today He has spoken to us through His Son, which this idea of the Son of God, we're going to see in Isaiah is going to be huge, is God Himself. Okay? And now I'm going to make some connections here. So Isaiah chapter 6. Let's go to Isaiah 6. I want you to see something. That is not the bell. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up. High and lifted. It's the same word that means exalted. So there's this really interesting concept. This becomes a phrase that Isaiah uses, and then Jesus is going to use it about Himself. You wait until the day you see the Son of Man high and exalted ascending to the heavens. Okay? So Isaiah 6, I see Him high and lifted up, high and exalted. Look at Isaiah 52:13. Now Isaiah 6 is when God, Isaiah seeing God on the throne. It's a moment where Isaiah falls down before God. I am undone, or I am a man of unclean lips, a people of unclean lips. That's where he's purified with the coal, comes and touches his lips. He's purified, ready to go out and preach the word. Now look at Isaiah 52:13. Behold, my servant shall act wisely, and he shall be high and lifted up, and shall be exalted. And you're going to lead us. And as many as were astonished at you, his appearance was so marred beyond human semblance, his form beyond that of children of mankind. So shall he sprinkle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him. And then you jump in Isaiah 53. Who is this high and exalted servant? Why would he be? So in Isaiah 6, God, right? We're looking for God to come and teach. God is on His throne. God is high and exalted. My servant will be high and exalted, who will teach you the ways of the Lord, if you've been reading, who will also die for you. Why will this servant be high and exalted? How will he be high and exalted? Well, you have the suffering servant. He will die on your behalf. He will die, and he will be what? He will be raised high and exalted. And what does the book of Acts begin with in the sense of when Jesus died, what did God do to him? He raised him up and sat him where? At the right hand, high and exalted. And that becomes a phrase that is used of God, but also becomes a phrase of Jesus. And so you're starting to see this concept build in Isaiah that the New Testament, here's my point, when you're reading your New Testament, if you just read over, Jesus says, I'm going to be high and exalted, I'm going to ascend to the Father, you're going to go, okay, that's a phrase, he's high and exalted, what does that mean? Or glorified. You're finding these concepts, these phrases that the Jews understood were messianic in nature. When Jesus says them of himself, that's why the Jews get so riled up. They knew exactly what he meant when he'd make phrases calling himself the Son of God. What did they assume when he says, hey, I'm the Son of God? What did they say? You're making yourself out to be equal with God? Well, is my son equal with me? No. But there is, go to read Daniel 7, the Son of God was God himself who would sit on God's throne. that makes him equal. So when Jesus is using this phrase, they're taking Old Testament concepts and working them into the life and ministry of Jesus. And my whole point about this whole overview class and looking at these themes and following these themes and looking at these words is your New Testament can be understood without the Old Testament in one sense, but you are going to miss so much that is established back here. So there's this servant would be high and lifted. Now let's go back to Isaiah chapter 9. Let's go back to Isaiah 9 for a moment. Look at verse 6. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be on his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Why would the Jews, when someone's coming and claiming to be the Son of God, think that he's making himself equal or making himself out to be God himself? Well, look at phrases like this. A child is given, a son is born, who will be called Mighty God, Heavenly Father, Prince of Peace. So when Jesus uses this phrase, he's taking an Old Testament theme concept that he's saying, this is me.
Not really a part of where you're going with this, but what did current Jews have to say about those passages? You know, why they refused to.
Like today?
Yeah.
So I'm not really sure. I'd have to talk to Greg Waterman, because Greg, he was a Jew. He's a friend of mine, went to school with me. He was a Jew, Messianic Jew. Or not a Messianic Jew, he was just a Jew. And he denied that Jesus came and that they did not believe, they believed that a Messiah would come, but he would not be the Son of God. So I guess I'm not really in on my modern Jewish understandings of what they believed. I just know that they thought the Messiah was going to come. He was going to be, God's son, but to them, Israel was God's son. Right? Israel was God's son. But when he starts saying the Son of God, and then he starts attaching passages to it that are only speaking of what they would believe, hey, that's God. That's God. That's God. Because remember, when this Messiah would come, they believed, where would God come back? God himself, the Spirit, would come and dwell in the temple again. In the teaching, they just thought the same old thing that was happening. Hey, God taught us. Yeah, through Moses. God taught us, right? God taught us through Isaiah. Well, when Jesus comes and he says, hey, by what authority are you doing it? Oh, my own. What? Only God has the authority to do teaching without having a superior authority. They were starting putting the pieces together. So I don't know what modern. All right. So we're gonna get into Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. Now, on your thing, if you have your notes, cross out Jeremiah here and put Isaiah. And if you haven't noticed, this red column is all what I'm showing is how each of these books are fulfilling Abrahamic covenant promises of seed promise, land promise. And down here in the green are the people who come and are the Messiah-like figures, but ultimately pointing to someone who's greater than them. Okay? And then a transition is how these books transition into one another as you're reading. Okay.